My name is Cynthia Cross, and I'm calling to order the June 17th meeting of the Issaquah Transportation Advisory Board. The first order of business is to approve the minutes. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. I'm seeing nodding, but I had to toggle back and forth. Okay. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
I see a bunch of hands. Anybody opposed? All right, minutes are approved. And do we have any public comment tonight, Stephen?
None that are in attendance at this time.
Okay. Before I move on, I do want to mention on the subject of public comments that I just want to remind everyone you should have received 2 public comments, and I would encourage you to read those. But I won't be reading them to the board at this time, just assuming that you can read that on your own. And so with that, we're on to regular business. Stephen, have I forgotten anything?
The only other thing was just with the call to order is just letting everybody know that our alternate David Holzberg had to resign his position just because he had a new work position, which changed his time demand. So he wasn't able to attend the board meetings anymore. So we are just vacant one alternate position.
And just so everybody's clear, I did ask that question, and that is the vacancy for the alternate position will be filled in the next logical cycle. So that's one of the benefits of having alternates. So we do lose somebody throughout the year, we've already got alternates all ready to go. So there won't be an interim cycle to replace him. Okay. So now we're on to regular business. The first item 4A, the TIP project review introduction. Stephen, you ready for that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me to discuss this item tonight. The purpose of this discussion is to provide a brief overview of the Transportation Improvement Program and how it relates to the Mobility Master Plan. I'll summarize the process to update the tip that the process we took on earlier this year, and then I'll go over the next steps on how we want to look over the projects identified in the tip. And there's a lot of ground to cover, so for this discussion, we split this full process over multiple meetings over the next couple of months, and this should allow us to cover all the topics that we need to update all the projects while still covering the rest of the items we have on our work plan. For tonight's discussion, we're hoping to get any feedback the board wants to provide specifically around the proposed process that we're proposing, because this is a brand new process, because we recently adopted the Mobility Master Plan that kind of warranted the need to update how we evaluate the TIP, but also how the scope of the projects in the TIP are kind of designed. And so the information to review and any other suggestions the board may have are welcomed. And so if there's no questions before I get started, I can start with the overview.
Hey, Stephen, this is Cynthia. I just also want to point out that not only is the Mobility Master Plan new, the Transportation Advisory Board is still relatively new. And so I assume that's another reason that the process isn't fully established.
Yes and no. If we didn't adopt a new Mobility Master Plan, we would have gone through discussions about the TIP process and evaluate. But it's really because of the Mobility Master Plan and the changes in priorities for the city that's really kind of driven the need to look at this comprehensively and not, in smaller pieces. And so you can kind of see this as almost a complete overhaul of our TIP process because of the new priorities identified in the Mobility Master Plan. And then if you have any forgot to mention before, if you have any questions or comments on any of the items that we're discussing tonight, please feel free to enter into the chat question or comment, and then Cynthia or John will let me know that you have a question or comment, just because I'm presenting, it's difficult for me to kind of see it. Second. Actually, Erica is trying to get it, so I'm gonna go back to my other screen and get her in before I start. Okay.
While you're doing that, Stephen, maybe take a look at your chat and just make sure that the default of the to line is, I guess we should put it as all panelists, because I think it defaults to just the host. And then that's relying on just the host. And I'm not even sure in this meeting who technically is the host. So if you switch your to line from the default, at least mine defaulted to host to all panelists, then it's easier to monitor the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I think by default I'm the host, but yes, please, if you put something in the chat, please switch it to all panelists, and that'll help the chair and John to identify if you have a question or comment. All right, going back to my screen. So getting started on the mobility master plan, you've heard most of this before, but as a quick reminder, the master plan is the city's main long-range planning document, which will guide all city planning and investments for the transportation system now and into the future. And so the goals and policies adopted as part of the comprehensive plan late last year, and the strategies and actions were adopted this past March. Most of the work is tied to the implementation of the master plan and related efforts. For the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, this is the city's short-range long planning document that helps the city plan and budget for transportation projects for the next 6 years. It outlines proposed funding sources and amounts for these projects in the context of the larger city budgeting process. And to note, it is a planning document, it's not the city's budget. So when a TIP or a CIP is approved, it helps feed into the budgeting process, but it is not the actual budget, just to differentiate. And the TIP is just the transportation element of the larger capital improvement program. And the biggest difference is that the CIP is updated every 2 years, and the TIP has to be updated every year so that the city remains eligible for any state grants. And now that we have the master plan, we have a guide to the types of projects we want to design and prioritize, which is why we're updating the TIP process and the projects identified in the TIP. And it's important that we integrate the new policies in the design and prioritizations of projects so that we're better equipped to meet our goals and better able to track how we're meeting our goals. And as you may remember, we've categorized all the TIP projects into these 4 different categories, which are areas based on how they're funded and prioritized. And so for tonight's meeting, we'll only be covering the projects that are currently underway to introduce this new process and give us a chance to make changes to this process before the next meeting when we cover a much larger list of projects. So for this process, it starts with tonight's meeting to cover the projects underway, and then next month we'll be covering a more robust set of materials to review and for the board to provide comment on. And we're hoping to simplify this with one of the attached tables that you saw tonight, similar to what for the projects that are underway. And then in August, we'll continue the discussions on future projects and reserve kind of a spot on the agenda for September for any final discussions that we need. And I just want to emphasize that there's really no rush on this process. This will all feed into the next TIP process in 2023, which won't start until at least January. And so we have half a year to cover all this, and we can break it up even more if necessary so that we can go through it all. And for the projects underway, you may have already noticed, looking through the materials, there's not much to cover for review. Only 2 projects really require further feedback at this meeting, and John's going to cover them in the next presentation. Because these projects are a little further along and closer to implementation, we'll be covering a lot more detail and information about them. We won't be going to this level of detail for all the other categories in the tip. For the spreadsheet that you saw where you had the name of the project and you had the identifier for the project and then a brief explanation of what's going to be changing in the scope, that's what we'll be reviewing at the future meetings when we're covering the other categories. And so in next month's meeting, we'll be bringing back the Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements project and the small strategic capital projects for further review. But for tonight, we're just going to cover the Newport the Newport project, Maple to Sunset, and the Newport SR 900 to 12th, which is right by the Tibbetts Park. And the goal for this process is to cover all the project scope changes that we need to cover to update all the projects to be consistent with the mobility master plan. And we'll take all this feedback over the next couple months and make the changes that we need to. And then that'll all feed into next year's TIP process, which we'll bring back to the board, and you can see how it all lays out once everything gets updated. And so the schedule on the screen is what can be expected for council review next year once we initiate the TIP process for next year. So for tonight's discussion, I'm going to go one question at a time. If you need me to go back to a certain slide, let me know. It's okay if you don't have any suggestions. We'll take that as we're on the right track. But for these questions, I just really want to focus on this process to make sure that we're covering what we need to based on what the board had asked for earlier this year. And so the first question, does the board members have any suggested changes to this process, or are we missing anything? And I can go back to any previous slides if it helps. And then Cynthia or John, you'll have to help me if anything gets entered into the chat.
Yeah, I'm watching, and I'm yes. It looks like Sujata has a comment. Go ahead, Sujata.
Yeah, I just as far as the process that you outlined, I think it's a good process, and I appreciate that you've planned well enough in advance that you've sort of chunked up these projects over multiple meetings because they can, you know, I mean, just by way of the amount of public comment we had through email on a couple of the projects, it's nice to be able to know we will have enough time as a board to sort of review. And so I do appreciate that part about this process is that you've given us multiple meetings and plenty of time for that. So, and since it's a new process, I wouldn't have any suggestions until we, you know, are maybe halfway through it, and then it'll be like, oh, for next time or something. So, yeah.
That's completely fair. I mean, it's brand new to staff, so we're not entirely sure if we'll be able to cover everything. But at the very least, we want to make sure that we're addressing a lot of the questions that the board had earlier this year, when we were just initially updating the the evaluation and the priorities for the TIP process. So if there's nothing else, I can move on to kind of the next question: is this all the type of information that the board is looking for? I mean, if you take a look at the attachment for this process, and I can move to that if that helps. Is this comprehensive enough? Is there enough detail in the type of changes that we're proposing, or should staff consider a new category or even just additional information to help describe each of the projects? Cynthia, John, are there any comments or questions?
I'm not seeing any. I think we're kind of trying to absorb. I still feel like we're at the 35,000 foot level, and I think that when I read through the materials, I think I had the same question I've had before. It's like I'm every time. So I think I'm guessing that people are absorbing, and that's why we're not getting a lot of discussion at this point. And one of the things I think we may be absorbing, and I'm not trying to speak for others, but for myself and maybe others have this as well, is it's sometimes hard to know what to do with the appendices because I always have the feeling there's a lot of really important information in there, and I start to dive into it, and it becomes so. Can you share with us a little bit more about the different appendices in the staff memo? And help us guide our focus. You've mentioned tables and spreadsheets, but I don't think I tracked. There's several spreadsheets and such, and so I just want to make sure I know exactly what you're saying and exactly where we are kind of. When is the time when we kind of dive a little deeper? I guess is sort of what I'm struggling with a little bit, and I'm not sure if others.
Sure.
Okay, so and I'm toggling back and forth between the staff memo and the. I only got one screen tonight, so so I see that you've put that up. And this is the list of projects within the TIP that are projects underway. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And from this list, only 2 of the projects will actually get discussed tonight, and John's going to go over that. For right now, I'm just wanting to cover the 35,000 foot level process and making sure, like, is this enough detail that we're going to be covered? Because in next month's this list will likely be 3 to 5 pages, and I don't want to overwhelm the board members with too much information, but at least enough so they can get a good idea of what's being proposed. And if it's helpful, one thing we can do is, change up the color scheme a little bit so it's easier to identify, the projects that we are asking about versus the ones not to worry about at all.
Okay, so I have one more comment, but I'll pause for a moment, make sure there's not others. I think what I was trying to figure out, I was trying to, an overused term of art, crosswalk this to, so proposed change is useful, but what's driving the change would also be a useful column. So we are, if I'm understanding correctly, as we go through the projects within the TIP, we will be looking at what are the not the changes to the project list, but what are the changes to the scopes, and mapping that back towards the values and strategic direction, and what do we call them, the guiding principles of the master mobility plan. And so is that under proposed changes? That's what's driving the changes, because we came up with this great plan and now we want to be reconciling that, and so that's the way we would reconcile that particular project.
Yes, and I think that's actually a good comment so we can tie it specifically back to where in the mobility master plan is it calling for this type of change. That's so we'll add that column.
Does anyone else? I'm kind of hanging out here by myself here, and we don't have the ability to see each other. Of course, I don't want to send the staff to do things that just one person, just me, but maybe just kind of, or is anyone else kind of feeling like that is?
Yes, the reason for the changes is definitely proposed changes, and something I'd like to see too. It makes a lot of sense.
Thanks. And I think, like Sujata said, probably after we walk through this, we'll have a better idea of what we think of the process. Seeing lots of nodding.
Yeah, I feel like this is a lot of a try and test process. I'm not too familiar, how it's presented today, but I think I'll I'll have more ideas as we get further into this process.
All right, well, I'm not seeing anything else in the comments. Does that bring us to, oh my goodness, remind me next time to have my two screens. Does that bring us to the specific changes that we're going to discuss, 4B?
Yes, so that brings us to John and his presentation, which,
Okay.
so just as a reminder though, when we cover the other categories in the tip of projects, it'll just be that table. It won't be this level of detail that we're going into with John. It's only because these projects are further along that we're asking this level of detail. And so just so people don't feel overwhelmed, like we're going to do this for all 150 projects. We're not. We're only going to be doing this level of detail for 4. And then for the rest, it's really going to be focused on that table and really higher level changes. So I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to get my presentation loaded up.
Tom, you have a question while John?
Yeah, a quick question, and John may answer it once he gets going, but I think the 4 projects we're talking about are 12th, Newport, 954th, Maple to Sunset, and the other one starting design, which is 900 to 12th, those 4.
It's going to be Newport, Maple to Sunset, Newport, SR 900 to 12th, the
Right.
Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements, and then the small strategic capital projects.
Okay, and those are both TBD, as opposed to the other ones are in design. Okay.
Correct. And we put TBD just because staff won't be ready until next month in August to present on those topics when they have additional information to present. And then John, I'm going to make you a presenter now. Okay, go ahead, John.
Okay. Is it showing the presentation? All right. All right, tonight I'm going to talk about Newport Way, and we're going to talk about 2 different sections of Newport Way. The first section's between Maple and Sunset, and then we'll talk about between SR 900 and 12th Avenue. The purpose of tonight's presentation, the reason why we're here is we want the TAB's input on these 2 different sections of Newport Way as we develop them. And the feedback that we specifically would like from the TAB are for a couple policy decisions on Newport Way, Maple to Sunset. And we need to reduce the costs of the project. And several of the ways we've identified multiple ways, including whether or not the city wants to underground the overhead utilities along this corridor, and what do we want to do for constructing retaining walls. Then the third thing that we're going to talk about is what do we want to see for the future of Newport Way between SR 900 and 12th. I'm going to go into a little bit of the history about Newport Way, Maple to Sunset. And this project actually began in the 1990s, but we're going to skip ahead until 2009 when the public involvement process began for this corridor. The city held a number of public meetings in addition to working with the city council and came up with a project concept. And the concept that council adopted in January 2011 was one that added a second southbound lane from Maple to just south of Holly. It also did not construct any medians, and the reason why was as the city was evaluating the performance of the medians versus the investment and the cost. The approved concept also decided that there would be roundabouts at the intersections of Juniper, Holly, and Dogwood. And the reasons that were listed at the time were livability, side street access, traffic calming, safety, especially with pedestrians and bicyclists, the ability to do U-turns at the roundabouts, efficiency, and long-term maintenance. And I want to back to the community involvement process because I forgot to tell you guys something about it. And it's kind of interesting looking back at the comments that the city received at those public involvement meetings. And a number of them were about how is the city going to pay for this project? And of course, here we are tonight getting to discuss what people were wondering about back in 2009. This is a slide that was from the presentation that was given to the council's transportation committee back in November 2010 when the city was looking at the different alternatives. And there were a number of alternatives that were considered, but the preferred alternative was a combination of two different decisions that the council made. And what would be the intersection treatments. And as I mentioned, the council went with roundabouts at Juniper, Holly, and Dogwood. So you can see the roundabout symbol there. And one thing that was discussed in a lot with the community was what would there be for driveway access? Because originally the city proposed restricting driveway access to right in and right out. And that's where a lot of the conversation about having a median or not having a median came. And the final decision was that there would be full driveway access, except for, looks like there's one driveway that's just too close to the Dogwood roundabout. One of the things that council asked the staff to do at the time was to look at the traffic and do a traffic analysis. And that traffic analysis showed the need for a second southbound lane on Newport Way from Maple to, at the time, about 600 feet south of Holly. And this slide was also in the council presentation from November 3rd, 2010. Once council adopted the section in January 2011, the design began that year, and it made it all the way to about 30%. And at that time, the city was, I believe it was having some budget troubles, and the project stalled and just went on the shelf. But a lot happened between when, I'll pause now. I see Micah, you've got a question?
Yeah, where do parents typically line up cars for picking up kids for that school? Like, is it one of the side streets or is it off of Newport Way?
I don't remember. I'll try and look into it and get back.
It's on Holly Street.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm right near there, and it's not
Yeah.
off of Newport.
It's
Okay. So
on
where-
Holly Street. They all line
Right.
up.
Does it
It's where
ever-
it's where the second roundabout, if you're going from top to bottom, the second
Yeah,
roundabout.
but not the
Holly Street.
intersection of Newport and Holly. It's the entrance to the school is down the
Off
block.
of Holly Street.
do it
Yeah,
ever get-
right.
ever get backed up to
Where that second roundabout is, and if you go down Holly Street and then turn into the school, that's where the student drop off and pick off. So it's not on the main drag at all.
Yeah. Does it ever get backed up to Newport?
Not really in the 25 years that we've had kids there.
Okay. I'll just do on that then. Thank you.
Yeah,
I live right.
I trust your guys' knowledge on that one better than although I will say I've never seen, I look at most of our citizen C-Click Fix tickets, and I've never seen one mentioning that one.
No, where the Newport has backed up is before the pandemic, when people would bypass getting off at Front Street to go down Issaquah Harbor Road, as they would get off at Newport, and Newport would be backed up all the way to basically to the top signal on the top left side, all the way down to Issaquah Harbor Road.
Dave Wagner, did you have a comment?
I do. And can you hear me? It looks like I'm
Yes.
okay. So I've lived here for 17 years right off of Newport. I've also driven school bus for Issaquah Valley. I can tell you there is no backup on Newport there's a slowdown, especially when the buses come out, but there is no backup on Newport. And the kids are picked up either in the school, which is Hawley down to the school entrance, or they're picked up on Hawley Street. Many parents go in that cutout where they can stop and pick up their kids. So there's never been a backup, to my knowledge, that's affected Newport Way.
From the school part, yeah.
Correct.
Hey, I'm just gonna let you guys know, just remind you guys that if you change your to line to all panelists, then we have a better chance at catching it on time. It defaults to host, which goes to Stephen, I believe. So better chance of catching it if you're under your chat, it says to all panelists. Thanks.
After the project stalled, a number of things happened. In 2012, the city adopted the Central Issaquah Plan, which identified Newport Way as a parkway, which is a scenic arterial. Part of the definition of a parkway also includes center medians, which is something that the 2011 concept did not have. And then in December 2017, the design manual was adopted by the city council, and the design manual did a number of things for projects within Central Issaquah, but specifically impacting the Newport Way Maple to Sunset project is projects that are in Central Issaquah that need a permit need to follow that manual, and it talks about the requirements for retaining walls with a maximum height of 10 feet, and if you need to exceed that, you need to terrace it with landscaping, and we'll talk some more about that. In May 2018, the city was awarded federal design funds, which on one hand was really great because now we can proceed with the design, although also with having federal design funds are strings attached in that the city does need to advance the project or pay back those funds. With those funds that we got in 2018, the city hired a consultant and we began working on the design. And we're trying to merge the 2011 concept with the Central Issaquah Parkway standard. And we came up with a section that we thought was really great, other than the cost estimate was really high. And we took that 30% design to a public open house. And it was very similar to the comments that were received back in 2009 and 2010, and that the community was still strongly, or especially the people who lived along the corridor, were really opposed to the medians and how they would restrict access to their driveways. In 2020, we paused the project as we had some vacant positions and just needed to prioritize other things. And we had the project paused and picked it back up earlier this year. The 30% design that I mentioned that we worked on in 2018 and 2019 had a cost estimate of $40 million. And as I mentioned earlier, we added the median back in because that's part of the Central Issaquah standard. And the goal was to try and maintain a consistent corridor. Another thing that we had in this concept was buffered bike lanes, which served a couple reasons. One, we wanted to provide for better bike facilities. And two, by adding the extra width that made the road a little bit wider, which would then allow emergency vehicles to pass. Because if we had a continuous median, we'd have a potential bottleneck and an unsafe situation for emergencies. And with that $40 million project that we came up with, and that was the cost for the right-of-way and construction, we looked at every potential funding source out there, and we came up with about $20 million in potential funding for the project, and that was with phased construction. And this is one change from in the presentation from your packet. I added in the utility reimbursement. So in addition to that 26 million, some of the utility relocations we can be reimbursed for, and I'll go into more about that later. The design team began looking at how can we reduce costs for the project to get the project's costs in line with potential grants that we could receive, traffic impact fees that were estimated that the city will receive because this is a project they can use traffic impact fees. And we came up with 5 ideas to reduce costs. And the first 3 are ones that can be done at the staff level, and they're more informational, although we still will have the opportunity for the tab to provide feedback on them. And we came up with an alternative cross-section. That saved about $6.1 million. One of the requirements of the Central Issaquah plan are that lights within Central Issaquah, and I should back up and say the Central Issaquah area is Newport Way between Maple and Holly is in Central Issaquah, and that's about 1/3 of the project. And from Holly to Sunset, the southern 2/3 are outside of Central Issaquah. And lights inside of Central Issaquah can not be any taller than 15 feet. And so we looked at what could we do outside of Central Issaquah. And we looked at, there's a turn lane I'll tell you about on Maple, and we came up with the idea that that turn lane could actually be a separate project. And then the 2 ideas that we really want to have an in-depth conversation for are, does this community want to keep the utilities overhead or underground them? Because that originally, I believe in our packet, showed a $4.7 million savings, and it still would save $4.7 million, but because the city can invoice some of the utility costs to the utilities, this will save the project $2.3 million. And the design manual has some retaining wall requirements that I'll talk about, that if we were to change what we're doing for the retaining wall, we could save some money. So for the revised concept that we came up with, oh, Tom, you have a question?
Yes, on the utilities, are they all on the poles by franchise? So sounds like maybe not, so we would bore some of the cost of putting them underground as opposed to them putting underground.
I didn't hear everything, but did you ask, are the utilities on the poles franchise utilities?
Yes.
Yes, they are. Okay. For the revised cross-section, what we ended up doing, the concept that we had in 2018 had a shared use path, and I'm going to use right and left as I'm looking at it. On the left side, that's the side with the blue house. It had a 12-foot wide shared use path. It had on-street painted buffered bike lanes. It had the center median, and on the right side, it had another on-street buffered bike lane, and it had sidewalk. So what we did is, going in line with the feedback we received from the community and keeping in line with the 2011 concept, we eliminated the center median. And then for the non-motorized facilities, instead of duplicating with painted bike lanes, a shared use path and sidewalk, what we did is we moved we kept sidewalk on both sides and then had protected bike lanes. And one of the reasons why we did that is the NACTO, which is where we get a lot of our bike design standards, say that for a street like Newport with the speed limit being 30 miles per hour and the traffic volumes, that we really need protected bike lanes, not on-street bike lanes and not a shared use path. So we went with that, and making those revisions really reduced the footprint down. And save money. And I saw, Janie, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if this revised plan incorporated the roundabouts or if that's a separate idea that was proposed.
Yeah, the revised plan still has the 3 roundabouts. That did not change. The next thing that we looked at was the street lighting. So as I mentioned, oh, Cynthia, yes.
Sorry, I wasn't sure when the right time to ask. Could you go back a slide? So I was wondering about the interface between these and the roundabouts. And the specific thing I'm interested in is what happens to the bicyclists, because it does get a little funky when you're on a separate path and you come upon a roundabout, because bicyclists, there's more confident one, there's different categories of cyclists, and some prefer to go through the roundabout because the cars have slowed, and you don't want to be forced onto the crosswalk at an awkward angle. And so it's actually in some ways safer to go through with the cars through the roundabout in a lot of roundabouts. And I'm no roundabout expert, but I have navigated many of these on a bicycle. And the ones that make you go onto the crosswalk make you really uncomfortable because you're entering the crosswalk at the wrong speed. And that makes you really vulnerable. And you're much safer going through the roundabout. So I'm just curious about when you separate the bike lane like this, what happens at the roundabouts?
We haven't gotten into that detail, but we know that when we get to designing the specifics of the roundabouts, what to do with the pedestrians is going to be a very detailed and important conversation, and the bicyclists.
Okay, so we can table that, but I just want to flag that as something. And then I see that Joseph and Micah have questions. We go Joseph and then
Before we get to Joseph, I was just going to add on to John's comment for NACTO and the newer national guidance and best practices. When moving in the direction of more proactive design and having protected intersections and not just protected bike lanes, you would actually have a separate bike crossing at the intersection for the roundabouts. So next to where you would have the standard white cross hatching, you'd have green hatching for the bicyclists. So there would never be a mixing zone. They would stay separated through the full way of crossing around the roundabout.
separate from the pedestrians?
Correct.
Oh, excellent. I'm not familiar with that, but that sounds like it would address the problem. Thanks. Yeah, let's go Joseph, then Micah, then Julian.
This is just a really quick question. So with this revised design, would the driveway still be full access driveways, like with the exception of that one right in, right out driveway, or would it change?
I wasn't able to hear the question. Can you say that again?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
A little bit. Let me just go ahead.
Okay, with the revised design, would the driveways still be full access driveways? Like with the exception of that one right in, right out driveway?
Correct. They would be full access.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're next.
Yeah, so I have something on this and also something on the street lights. Actually, I originally put the thing for the street lights, but when I passing by a bicyclist, when I'm in my car, I give them the space based on the new law that we're supposed to give that extra space. I don't see a lot of cars do that, and so because of that, and because I have a family that likes to bike a lot. I like having them separate. I like having stuff like trees. I do like that added safety, but I am curious, I guess, and I probably want to hear more from the perspective of someone who has more experience on the bicycling with cars. The idea of with pedestrians, they're more typically going to stop. And for a bicyclist to stop, I assume that's a significant impediment to being able to commute, is having to stop at crosswalks and get going again. Or maybe I'm just a bad bicyclist and it's harder for me to get going again. And so, cars expect people to stop generally, right? And I don't know whether cars would expect a bicyclist that's separated to act like a pedestrian or act like a bicyclist that's biking on the road. And so, well, yes, a car should look out for a bicyclist. At the end of the day, the car is the dangerous thing on the road. And so I'm concerned about that possible interaction. Just the unexpected, are they going to behave like a person or are they going to behave like a car because of that separation and almost appearing to the car that they're more within the how the just someone that's on the sidewalk would be moving.
Micah, do you mean for your question to be when the bicyclists cross the roadway, or if they go in the bike lane to bypass any pedestrian traffic?
So when they cross the roadway, and I'm not concerned if they're going straight and the car is going straight, but the car is turning. They're sort of looking out for. You're expecting to look out crosswalk for a person. I'm concerned about them expecting to look out for a bicyclist. And does the bicyclist keep moving? Does the car expect for them to keep moving? Do they stop because it's a crosswalk and they're not in the travel lane? If the car is coming at the same time, who goes first? I'm just concerned about people in cars not knowing what to do and that causing an accident that can seriously injure or kill someone. Because of this division, I like the division from the perspective of as they're both traveling in a lane, I like that safety, but I'm concerned about when they basically have to re-merge to cross, even though it's a separate lane, you're sort of re-merging because you can't have those trees in the way anymore.
John, do you want to take that or you want me to get started?
Why don't you start it, Stephen?
Okay. So for crossings around roundabouts, the crossings are actually offset a little bit further away from where the roadway would travel normally to give drivers of vehicles who are coming around the corner for the roundabout actually a little bit better angle to view who's crossing the street, whether it's cyclists on their own separated crossing or pedestrians crossing. Those crossings also typically require a reflective flashing or a flashing beacon for the crossing too, to give an indicator to any of the drivers that someone is going to be crossing at that location, just to give that extra visibility for people crossing at those locations. And so, yes, there's worry about that, but no more than any typical crossing, only because we will be offsetting those crossings a little bit further away from where the road typically runs parallel.
Okay. And then on the lights, you may have just been about to go into it until we got back. My question was about why the shorter lights, and I assume that has to do with light pollution issues, but there may be more to it.
Well, part of the central Issaquah plan is having the pedestrian level lights as the look and feel for the whole area. And so that's my understanding of why we have the shorter lights. And that's really, once you get into the land use, and that's not necessarily my strong expertise as a transportation engineer. I see it differently, but I also understand the aesthetics that they're trying to go for as planners, looking at how central Issaquah will redevelop and what look and feel we want. And the shorter lights are what we want for that area as it redevelops. So a couple other questions.
Yeah, I think Julian was next. I'm kind of tracking this.
Yeah, I wanted to reiterate Cynthia's comment earlier about the roundabouts. Newport Way is probably my top corridor for travel when I'm biking around town, and I really enjoy just a smooth ride right through the road. So having to be interrupted by going onto the sidewalks and going all the way around. And I know that this corridor is well traveled by most cyclists. So I'm sure there are other designs for incorporating cyclists into the roundabouts, but it's just my comment.
Julian, when you say incorporating the cyclists into the roundabout, do you mean have the cyclists drive in like the vehicle driving lane in the roundabout, or just in total incorporation as part of crossing the roadway?
Well, I've seen in some Google Street Views of like Netherlands or something. They have these roundabouts where the bike lane continues into the roundabout instead of having a choke point. It really gets uncomfortable, especially the roundabout on Newport Way towards the zoo, having to suddenly merge into the car lane. It can kind of be uncomfortable, especially since it's such a high speed corridor. There's no way I'm going to go onto the sidewalk for that, for example.
Got it. Yeah, I think the design we would pursue is that the separated bike lane would never discontinue even through crossing intersections. It would just have its own crosswalk, its own separated crosswalk specific for bicyclists, separated for pedestrians, so there would never be a mixing zone. So there's better expectation where cyclists can be for cyclists, but also for drivers who are coming around the roundabouts.
I know it still allow for a very speedy travel through the roundabout, correct?
For bicyclists?
Yeah.
Yes. Still, yielding right away when cars are already going through the crossing, but yes, the idea is that cyclists would have to stop at every intersection.
Would not have to stop, right? They would
Correct.
keep their momentum to the, yeah, okay. I think Tom was next. I'm tracking this, and then Eric is after Tom.
Yeah, so my comment is coming up to a roundabout, just looking at that section, as you get to the roundabout, you bring the bike lane into the road as a green lane and carry that green lane, almost can be a circle around the roundabout. So the bike lane would be green, continuous going through the roundabout to the other side and then back onto a shared, or onto its own pathway. That way a car that's in the vehicle recognizes the green lane as the bike lane. The bike would still have to yield to who's ever in the roundabout to start with, as like a normal vehicle. But if they're off on a sidewalk on the side, as the vehicle comes through the roundabout and starts making its turn onto the exit out of the roundabout, a pedestrian is much slower. They're going to catch an eye of the pedestrian. They're maybe waiting there to cross, but won't necessarily catch a bike that might be 30 feet back as he's starting to turn into the exit of the roundabout and is right there at the street by the speed that he's traveling just as he's entering there. So I would see, unless you stop the bicycle there and have them treat it like a pedestrian to cross through the exit leg of the roundabout, that would be introducing potential for pedestrian or bicycle car hits, as opposed to bringing the bicycle back onto the road with the green lane and having them occupy the lane and then back onto the thing to be able to continue a little bit more smoothly through the roundabout section.
Yeah, Tom, I think we share the same concern, and that's part of the reason why we would want the offset, so that it's not a straight across the intersection that the bicyclists would have to go. They would have to go 10 feet away from the actual intersection where the crossing would be located, and that gives drivers and bicyclists a better chance to see each other before either of them are crossing wherever the crosswalks are.
Right, you probably have to make sure that no trees or bushes, so that there would be sight distance as
Correct.
he's coming out. He's got the line of sight to the
So-
bicycle coming up to that crossing.
I don't want to cut this off too prematurely, but I do want to say what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of people on this board that have a lot of concerns and opinions, and it seems like we're getting into maybe design. And so what I'm going to propose, and I know Erica's next. I don't want to cut you off, Erica, but I do want to suggest that Stephen and John just make sure that when we get to this stage where we're going to look more closely at specific intersection design, that we make sure there's plenty of time for the tab to review that, because it sounds like there's a lot of knowledge, information, you know, even a little passion mixed in there. So it seems like we're getting into design, and maybe we won't have time for that because that's a pretty deep dive.
Fingers crossed we'll be meeting in person, because that would be a perfect one to actually have paper and get input.
But I think we should make sure we make our concerns clear. And it sounds like obviously so we were on revised cross section and we got down the rabbit hole of intersection. So I want to let Erica go, and then I actually did have a question about the median, but I'm going to go Erica and then back to me.
My concern was more a couple meetings back. I at least for the first time learned about crosswalk fatigue, and I'm just curious what that's like for if we're putting in a couple of roundabouts where there's going to be like higher traffic of like pedestrians, bikers, and people using cars. I would like to know more about that, or if what is not a concern at all.
Well, anytime we have a potential for pedestrian and vehicle collision, it is a high priority. And for this, we'd follow the pedestrian crossing guidelines. And a lot of times at roundabouts, we'll put in the rectangular rapid flashing beacons. And I wouldn't even be surprised at the Holly one if we end up having a pedestrian signal that would actually give cars a full red. But as we get to the details of the design, the pedestrians and bicycles for safety is going to be the top priority of the project. And then everything else is a benefit.
Okay. John, were you done? Sorry, I'm hearing some noise.
Yes.
Okay. So I was just going to say, we did kind of blow right past the elimination of the median. And that was a requirement for a parkway. And you told this great narrative about this history. And then suddenly there was a conflict. And I lost the denouement, the part where the conflict gets resolved. So, and I just see the answer here. So was there, can you do that?
So, go ahead. Did I interrupt?
Oh, no, sorry. Just tell us more about the median and the argument for making it go away and being able to resolve that with the what I understood to be design guidelines for the parkway.
Yeah. Well, inside the Central Issaquah circulation standards is a hierarchy of priority, and pedestrians and bicycles users are at the top of the list, and on-street parking, vehicular lanes are during the bottom. And so what we did is, because we needed to narrow this section down, is we used the rules that are outlined, or the procedure outlined in the Central Issaquah plan, in order to get what's called an administrative adjustment of standards, which is something that we'll apply for here in a little bit. And with that, it made sense to then eliminate the center median, because we don't want to eliminate the planter strip, because that helps separate the pedestrians and the bicyclists. We did not want to eliminate the bicycle facilities, because having people be able to safely bike on this corridor is a high priority. Obviously, sidewalk is a huge priority, especially with the school along this corridor. And so then it really came down to the center median or the second southbound lane. And we actually had our traffic engineer look at what would happen if we got rid of that second southbound lane. And what ended up happening is the traffic backup from the existing merge. So if you are heading, I'll say, southeast on Newport Way, and you're at the intersection of Newport and Maple near the Target, and you're heading south where the two lanes meet up, well, that would create a huge backup, and that's why we needed that second southbound lane. So it's just a matter of working the priorities in the Central Issaquah plan to try and narrow the cross section up to something that would have less impacts, need less right of way, and be less expensive to construct.
Thanks. Let's see. I see that Julian has a question, and Julian, is your question on this slide?
Yeah, it was about the second lane. How do we ensure that, because this second lane is not going to go all the way to where Hobart is, right? So how do we ensure that it's just not going to become another choke point just a little bit further down the road?
Well, that's why we had our traffic engineer do the modeling. Doing the traffic modeling's outside of my area of expertise, but that's what they're saying. What I noticed on the corridor is really the choke point is Front Street. And I would describe Front Street as a wall, at least before the pandemic. It was basically a wall that cars would hit and just back up. And but the modeling with the traffic volumes shows that having this southbound lane, and originally it looked like it'd have to go 600 feet south of Holly. The current modeling shows 900 feet south of Holly. But with the future, and when I say future, that's the 2040 traffic volumes, that it should perform well and keep the intersections south of there from being backed up. But I think as long as Front Street is backed up, that the southern section, this corridor, will have traffic congestion. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So for the street lights, as we talked a little bit earlier, the Central Issaquah street lights are limited to 15 feet tall. And originally we wanted to keep the same look and feel of the corridor. And so in 2018, we said we're going to use the same street light for the entire corridor. But as we started looking at ways to save money, we decided that once we get outside of Central Issaquah or south of Holly, we're going to keep the same style of light. So it'll look the same, but it'll be taller. And that'll save about $600,000. Another interesting thing about this project, which I didn't talk too much about, is it also included a right turn lane from Maple to Maple. And that may sound a little bit confusing unless you're staring at maps of Issaquah. So if you're at Trader Joe's or Wild Finn or Target, and then you want to head towards 17th or SR 900, you would get to the intersection of Maple and Newport, and you would actually turn right onto Maple. I guess you could also go straight on to Newport, but the project originally involved constructing a right turn lane for the traffic heading down the map or south, and then turning their right or left as you're looking at it on the map onto Northwest Maple Street. And the reason for that is our concurrency model says that sometime by 2040, we will need that right turn lane in order to accommodate growth. But we don't need it right now. And one of the hopes is that as development occurs, that might actually get triggered by redevelopment, and maybe the city wouldn't have to pay for that project, or we could use traffic impact fees and build that project when it's needed, or who knows, if lots of ifs. But by eliminating that portion of the project and making it its own project, that saves the project $600,000. And at this point, if anyone has any other comments or questions on either the typical section, street lighting, or right turn lane, we can talk about those before we go on to the overhead utilities and retaining walls and the other section in Newport.
So with the right turn lane, are there any multimodal improvements for Maple Street also planned? For example, if you're coming from Newport on the south into the Issaquah Commons, there's a bike lane on one side of the intersection, but it just abruptly ends on the other side, and that can sometimes lead to some conflicts with the drivers.
Right.
So
For that section, there would be the multimodal improvements required by the Central Issaquah plan. And I can't remember if that's I think it's probably a core street, but I'd have to double check, which would have sidewalk and bike lanes. I'm not 100% sure, but long-term there would be something. Now, I'll say that with a caveat in that when we adopted the mobility master plan, we actually set a higher level of bike facilities than what's in the Central Issaquah plan. And so that's something the city will need to look into. I think that'll be a future tab meeting, but the mobility master plan said that within Central Issaquah, bike facilities are to be designed to level of traffic stress 2 or greater. And so I guess the easy answer is there will be something, but I can't exactly tell you at this moment what it would be.
Looks like David Wagner and then Jerry have questions. David, if you're talking, we can't hear you. You got to take yourself off mute, maybe.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Sounds great.
Yes.
Okay, John, just a clarification on that second southbound lane. That'll run from Holly Street. How far south?
900 feet.
Um,
When it goes from Maple to 900 feet south of Holly.
okay, I'm trying to remember what it is now. That second lane does run, but it merges.
Correct. It merges pretty close to the intersection with Maple. I don't remember exactly, but it's in the vicinity.
It's
Yeah.
probably 400 or 500 feet.
Yeah, by the King County Library building, that's where it pretty much merges back in.
Yeah, even before that, it's almost a road rage thing with some of the drivers, especially on peak hours. Thank you.
Jerry?
Yeah, my question was kind of simple, and I'm sorry, it's about the roundabouts. I was thinking perhaps there might have been a cost savings if you didn't have a roundabout, maybe at Juniper or Holly, but maybe that was difficult for the public. They wanted both roundabouts because they're so close together.
Internally, I had a lot of discussion both with Stephen and with other staff members and our consultant. Did we want to look at not constructing the roundabouts? And I'll go a little bit into that conversation. The intersection of Newport and Juniper, if we didn't construct a roundabout, we'd need to build a traffic signal at that intersection. And a signal and a roundabout are about the same amount of money with more long-term costs on a traffic signal. Where it gets tricky are Dogwood and Holly. And one of the two, and I don't remember which one, actually met the warrants for a traffic signal, but it said that it wouldn't have the volume until I think 2023 at the soonest, but that's probably much later. And so I decided to just limit the scope just because I didn't want to change too much on the project and decided to leave them with roundabouts, especially with the in-depth conversation. But it was something that we did discuss. One of the downsides, and I guess I would ask this back to the tab, is if we don't have roundabouts at Holly and Dogwood, and that those are just stop sign controlled, so Newport would have no stop sign, and Dogwood and Holly would have stop sign. I was really concerned about people being able to drive around town, and that people who live on Dogwood or Holly would then get to Newport, they'd hit that Front Street brick wall and they wouldn't be able to turn. That was really my concern. And but I guess I'd also say if there's strong disagreement, I'd love to hear it.
It would be interesting to do another traffic study, perhaps, another year later, a year after COVID, to see what our traffic patterns are, and maybe you could make some cost savings changes then,
Well,
especially if you don't have the funding now. I'm just,
yeah,
it's just an
well,
idea.
I thought about that, although because we're designing for 2040, I want to keep that in mind because I think even though well, who knows what the future is going to hold. And ideally, our bike facilities, this is me, just my personal opinion, our bike facilities would be so wonderful that everyone would want to hop on their bike and not on their car. But the other thing that we have discussed, and this is something that could be changed later, is that Dogwood, we could save, I want to say about 600,000. I'd have to double check if we were to build a mini roundabout similar to what's at Trader Joe's and Target. And it doesn't perform as well as the regular roundabout. And what my thought was just kind of keep that in our back pocket because this project will need to be phased. And the design will probably get to about 60% for the entire corridor. And then what we would do is take maybe from Maple to Juniper and complete the design and then keep going and eventually work our way to the Dogwood segment. And the Dogwood segment's going to be the hardest one to phase. And if we needed to, at that point, we could look at the mini roundabout and the pros and cons if we're having a hard time funding that final phase.
So I see four more comments and we're having a good discussion. I want to do a time check and Stephen, I think so it sounds like we have lots of time to go through these substantive things. We don't want to get behind on keeping equity at the top of our list. So I'm wondering from John and Stephen if this is feedback that's valuable, but probably in the next 5 minutes, we want to, I see that there's a lot more slides and we haven't even gotten to the utility or I keep having to toggle back and forth, the
retaining walls.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the other section, yeah.
And so this is all really good. And I don't worry, the other four that have said they want to make a comment, that's great. And this is a really good discussion. I want to know if you're getting what you want from it and if we should just finish this discussion and then not move to the utilities. And is that going to work with our work program? You just finished telling us that we're not in a huge rush. I want to make sure I'm tracking and managing time at the same time.
So the priority, because we've got a city council meeting coming up on June 29th, is to get the TAB's feedback on the wall and the retaining wall, or the retaining wall and the underground utilities. That the other section of Newport, that would work to table that one to another meeting. The feedback on undergrounding and the retaining walls is very timely.
Okay, so there were 4 people. Sujata already said she's happy to move on. If anyone is not happy to move on, let's get what they need from us and then make sure we don't shortcut the equity discussion. And we can try to compress the rest of the meeting. Does that sound okay? And then we can circle back to roundabouts.
Okay, since I was the first comment, so I personally strongly support the use of roundabouts as long as they're well designed for all modes of traffic. But I also want to know, like, how would all types of traffic be accommodated before and after the ends of the project? For traffic coming from Newport, from the Tibbetts Park and then towards Sunset. How would the mergers happen, basically?
Well, Oh, are you talking about from a bicycle or a car or everyone?
Yeah, everyone. Yeah.
Everyone. Okay, so the bicycles would be, or the vehicles would be controlled by traffic signals, and it would be very similar to on each end what's currently out there. For the pedestrians in areas where we have sidewalk, we'd still have sidewalk. We've got more improvements to make to build to complete our gaps, and like we've got some facilities between this project and the Tibbetts Park, but there's improvements to be made in there. And so this is just one spot to start. Ideally, the park strategic plan would have some sort of good non-motorized facility that would go all the way from what I call Newport West, which would be Bellevue, all the way onto this Newport. Okay.
Sounds like a hot topic we definitely need to spend more time on, but let's, if it's okay, let's switch gears and get what they need for council.
Okay. So this discussion on the overhead utilities is a discussion that I really want your feedback on, because I think it talks about the community's priorities and values. And as we're trying to reduce our costs in order to get this project to something that we can build, there's some difficult decisions to make. And this is a project, or a picture of the project at Eastside Fire and Rescue. And I'm going to point out a few things, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide. These upper wires here, those are transmission lines, and this is a transmission pole. And so even if we underground the utilities, you can't underground transmission lines. So these poles, they'll be relocated, but they'll still be along the corridor, and these wires will still be along the corridor. What we're talking about are this small pole here and these wires down here, and whether we want to underground them or not. And so, as I mentioned, the transmission lines will remain. The lower wires, the distribution system, and the telecommunications, those can be undergrounded. The city street standards do require undergrounding. The comprehensive plan for the city says that the city wants to underground the overhead utilities. And we require private development to underground the utilities. And at the same time, and originally I thought it was going to save 4.7 million, but after realizing we can get reimbursed from the telecommunication utilities, and we can get partially reimbursed from Puget Sound Energy. And by doing that, the cost savings ended up only being 2.3 million, with the delta being revenue that we could have. So it still gets us down to the $26 million range. One of the drawbacks to undergrounding utilities is there's a construction risk, lots of conflicts. It's a slow process. Whenever you see a project that's taking forever to construct, usually it's because they're undergrounding utilities and trying to work around something. So the original recommendation, and I still think it's the recommendation, although I don't say it as strong as I did back when I thought it was 4.7 million, was to not underground. But I really want your feedback on it, because I think this is a community value and a priority. And so with that, I would like to open it up to discussion on this item.
It looks like we could, Julian, if this is relevant to the, utilities, and Julian, then Micah.
Okay, so first basic question. What are there any other utilities underground at this time, like natural gas pipelines or anything else?
Yeah, well, in specific for this corridor, I'm sure there's gas. There's probably some of the telecommunication utilities are underground.
Mm-hmm.
There are other utilities under the ground. There's water, there's a regional water line. So there's a number of existing underground utilities.
So would any of the undergrounding process conflict with I mean, would you have to orient, like, or change the direction drastically with that?
I am sure, yes. Do you remember, if you remember back when I said the construction risk, and whenever you get under the ground, it is a big mystery and you will find things and they won't be where you thought they were. You'll have to, uh, it's a slow process. Like, for example, on East Lake Sammamish Parkway, about 5 or 6 years ago, we undergrounded the utilities between 62nd, or yeah, just south of 62nd to southeast 56th. And there would be all kinds of things where we would need to make adjustments. The power would be in the wrong spot where we try and intercept. It's lots of field adjustments and changes happen when you underground utilities.
So looking at the guiding principles of the MMP, the thing that seems like it might have to do with this would be preparing for or anticipate transformation related to our electrical needs. You know, as we have more electric cars, more electric appliances, are underground utilities harder to upgrade, or specifically these types of utilities, whether that's power or telecom, like running fiber? Is that harder and more expensive to do, or in the future if we do that underground?
It would be for PS. Well, I will say if the utility does not properly plan, yes, it would be, because it's a lot easier to, well, actually, technically, all new utilities would have to go underground. And so they would have to go underground whether we did it or not. So it would be about the same for future utilities, other than, I will say, PSE, my experience, usually they try and think ahead really well into the future and what demands would be. And if they need, they add in extra conduits for capacity upgrades.
So in other words, if they needed to upgrade in the future, they'd be paying 100% of area?
Correct.
My comment was just that if we were going to take a vote on what to do, my vote would be to keep them above ground. 2.3 million in the grand scheme of infrastructure projects, I understand, isn't that much change, but I think it would be better used to possibly improve pedestrian access, especially in this area where connection from residential areas to the transit center is really important, and right now is kind of lacking, especially along Newport. So that was just my comment, that I think that would be a better use of those funds.
Thanks, Janie. If I'm tracking, then Tom is next. And Tom, go ahead and put both of your.
Yeah, my comment is if you keep the high power lines above ground and you put the distribution lines below ground, that we get most of the distribution going into the businesses all below ground. The high power lines, they're pretty expensive to put underground. So those would be the most expensive ones to maybe just keep those on the poles, and that would clear up the view as far as right along the street of the lower elevation lines, which are all the distribution lines, and the high tension lines are all quite high in the sky.
Thanks.
Jerry, then Joseph.
Okay, my quick comment was the fact that even Tom mentioned that putting utilities underground is for new utilities, and these utilities exist now. So is our policy the fact that because it's a roadway corridor, we're going to have to put those utilities underground because they are existing? So why do we have to move them underground? I think a good argument is because they're existing, we don't have to do that as part of this project.
Yeah, and so our policy is very specific that when a property develops, their frontage has to underground the utilities along it, the existing utilities. So, for example, at one time there was a proposed subdivision called Ennis Wood, and if that had gone forward, they would have had to underground their utilities. And it's a little bit murkier whether the city project has to or not. And so on Dogwood, we didn't underground all the utilities when we did that project. And so I can argue it either way. And what I'm really interested in is the TAB's feedback on how do you guys value that $2.3 million and the view and service of underground utilities.
Right, and then I would be for keeping those utilities overhead since the high transmission lines are already going to be visible anyway. You're not going to have a lot of extra unsightly look since you're still going to have those high transmission lines there anyway. So I'm for keeping the overhead utility.
Joseph?
Yeah, I agree a lot with Jerry and Janie because like even if those like the transmission lines were put underground, there'd still be those high powered like lines still above ground that would be visible. So I think it's better to just save $2.3 million so that it could be allotted to like other projects because that's like a lot of money that could be put towards like other infrastructure. And also I think like Micah brought up a really good point that it might be really inconvenient to put it underground, especially with like the change in demand, like in terms of energy and like upgrading. So I think it's better to just keep it above ground and save the $2.3 million.
Thanks. Tom, I think did you already say what you were going to say? I'm just looking at the order of the comments and.
Oh, yes, I did. I was talking about the distribution lines going underground and the high
Okay,
tension
that's what I
lines
thought.
staying below. Yeah.
So I'll just weigh in here and I'll just say that I think I'm a big believer in putting utilities underground just visually. I don't know anything about the requirements. I'm usually, if you're gonna, open it up, if you're gonna do a project, you might as well fix it. But the fact that the transmission lines have to stay anyway, I totally agree with your recommendation. My only caveat is I just want to make sure that we're treating other applicants, permit applicants fairly so that we're not applying a different standard. And I thought Jerry's comment was interesting. I'm not sure, John, you answered it directly because I think the question is, does that standard apply to maintenance, or is this arguably maintenance because the roadway already exists? And so whatever it is, I just think that we have to treat everybody equal, and that's a fairly big hot button for me. So I would think if we decide not to do this, and so take your recommendation, I would just want to make sure that we're treating permit applicants the same way.
And that's one of the things that I want to talk to council about is policy direction could be not to underground where we have the high transmission.
Yeah, that seems like a clean way to take care of it.
Right.
And then that was all I had to say. Then Christy was next.
Thank you, Cynthia. And actually, I completely concur with what you said, Cynthia. I really think that there needs to be a policy level discussion at the council about sort of making sure things are equal, because without undergrounding those utilities and having it resolved at this time with this project, or specifically along Newport, I think it sets us up for issues in the future as those parcels start to redevelop and the valley floor under the Central Issaquah plan starts to evolve a little more. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So, yeah, I do think there are good arguments to be made on either side of the issue, but again, because of the transmission lines and they have to stay not underground, I think even though that this corridor is going to become more densified and more development is going on this corridor, those transmission lines are going to stay there. And even though putting stuff underground makes them less natural disaster prone or less environmentally impactful, usually, I think I'd be on the side of keeping them overground.
David, it looks like you're next, and then Tom had another comment he wanted to make.
I'm just going to concur quickly with the others that I agree. Those utility lines are on the west side of Newport. I live right here, right off of Dogwood, so I know them. And the transmission lines have been there for years and years and years, and easy to service, as well as the other utility lines. I think the smart thing would be to save that money, so I concur.
Tom, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 comments. One is when the windstorms, usually it's the distribution lines that are taken down by trees, and the high tension lines are high enough that they're not affected by the trees. And just one comment or question for everybody is how do people feel about the visual of the high tension lines, which are kind of high and out of sight, versus the distribution lines? Just, I'm just curious what people's thoughts are. Is, does one more obtrusive than the other? And my thought for undergrounding the distribution lines is mostly because of ice storms and windstorms, taking power down.
To your question, I think with the increased development that's planned for this road, I feel like that distinction, high versus low, is going to be kind of taken away in terms of visual disturbance. I'm not sure though.
So it sounds like that's a good discussion. It sounds like you've gotten some pretty clear feedback. In fact, am I wrong about this? We didn't obviously take a vote. We're not taking action, but I'm hearing more people saying that they
I wrote
want
down
to keep.
what everyone said. It was great feedback, very helpful. If anyone after this meeting has opinions or wants to weigh in, feel free to send me an email, and that also works too.
And I know you want to talk about retaining walls, and then when we're done with that, we'll do a time check. I think we all have a lot of really curious people, and we're all just getting rolling, and we have a lot of questions. I do want to respect the time, or else decide that if everyone decides they have a few extra minutes, we can go longer. But I want to encourage people to help John prepare for his meeting with council by telling him what we think about his recommendation.
All right. As I mentioned, the design manual limits the height of the retaining wall to 10 feet or less, and walls taller have to be terraced. And when we started design, we didn't realize that this manual actually applied to both corridor projects and to private development. And so it was later on we discovered it. And so that $2 million savings was based on the assumption, because we had assumed that we would build the retaining wall like the proposed Enniswood development. If we were to fully follow the design manual, it would end up costing the project about an estimated $20 million, or just make it infeasible. And I wanted to read the objective in the design manual for sites with hillsides, and it says, development will minimize disturbance to hillsides, respond to the natural grade, and provide visual mitigation such as terraced walls and revegetation on disturbed areas. And so the design manual is really trying to protect hillsides. And in my opinion, it was probably written from the point of view, if you had a parcel of land, the city doesn't want to have someone just flatten it and have these really tall retaining walls just to maximize buildable space. And then we as a community lose these forested hillsides. And so the recommendation is to install a single retaining wall 2 feet behind the sidewalk and not terrace that. And as for how to get there, I'd work with council on the specifics of what we would need to do to the design manual. So I want to keep this more of a philosophical question, and I'll try and go quickly for time. And so I've got a couple visuals, and the first one is the green wall, and this is 2 feet behind sidewalk, just a single retaining wall. And this blue wall here is what we had assumed with the 30% design. That was what the Enniswood development had, about a 4-foot wall, a little bit of a space, and then a taller wall. But if we were to truly follow the design manual, we'd be going back quite a ways into the hillside. And one of the things we learned from the engineers who work on the retaining walls is these front walls are just really for look. And what we have is one giant retaining wall behind that holds everything back. And then this is more just for visuals. And this is a plan view just showing the impacts of how much of that hillside we would need to disturb in order to build this terraced retaining wall. And so the back here is the back where we'd be disturbing, and over here is where that sidewalk would be. And so we'd have to lose quite a bit of hillside, and I think it was about 3/4 of an acre of hillside we would have to lose in order to fully comply with the design manual. And so my opinion is, or my recommendation is based on the intent of the design manual, but I did want feedback from the tab.
Looks like Micah, then Julian have comments.
So assuming the structural support when it comes to erosion, landslides, etc., is the same or better for that shorter, lower cost wall, I would completely agree. It seems like the intent of the design manual from the little snippet I saw about it that you just presented would imply that disturbing less of the hillside is actually what we should be doing in the first place, and setting aside the cost and look benefit. So yeah, I would support your recommendation.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, the retaining wall in general is going to disturb that area. It's a very high transit corridor for wildlife in particular. So I think if we were to disturb more of that hillside, that really nice hillside, it would be detrimental to the wildlife in the area. So I would support putting the retaining wall just 2 feet back and make it tall there.
Thanks, Julian. Tom?
Just so that I understand the area, it's from where the Pickering driveway is area down to where the hairstylist place is, just across from about where Juniper Street comes in. That's the main area where the walls would go.
Tom, I missed part of what you were saying. You're talking about that's near Juniper?
Yeah, just the limits of the wall is really between Juniper and Holly up to where the Pickering driveway is, up by the intersection. Okay.
Yeah, it really goes from the Pickering Place driveway to just
right by
about
the
to
haircut
Juniper, right
place.
in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, I would probably tend to see, just since it's such a short stretch, probably a single taller wall in that area.
Thanks, Tom. Sujata and Christy, if you could just make your comments into the, then it'll be on the record, because I don't think chat ends up this meeting.
I agree with the shorter, cost-effective solution.
Hi, everyone. This is Christy, and I also agree with the shorter solution.
I didn't put my name in. This is Cynthia, and I was just going to say that I also don't have any problem with the shorter wall, but I have the same comment I did before, and I just don't have enough knowledge about the specifics or these things in general, but I just want to make sure that we're treating like matters in a like way, no matter who the applicant is.
When you say shorter wall, are you talking a single wall or the terraced walls?
I thought it was the 2-foot wall. That's what the recommendation.
Or the wall 2 feet from the sidewalk. Just one wall 2 feet from the sidewalk.
Yeah, the green color wall.
Right, that's the same wall I'm thinking. Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, I see that wall as being not as high as if we went through the setback and tried to follow the code or the design manual. So I agree with the wall being closer to the sidewalk, one wall being closer to the sidewalk. And like, I know the city of Newcastle, they have a much busier intersection. Oh, what's the name of that street? Cool Creek Parkway. But it seems like what they did with their retaining walls, I thought it turned out really nice. And actually along SR 900, where they did that fake rock wall, that seemed to blend in pretty well on the way to Talus. So is that sort of what you have in mind? But maybe the walls won't be quite as tall?
Well, they wouldn't be as tall. I haven't looked into whether we want to add a rock face or not, and probably might come down to cost. And I'd have to also read what the design manual talks about for wall styles and stuff, but future things to figure out.
So there are a couple more notes in the comments, some to me directly, and you're getting a lot of, so David Wagner and Erica Boyd both are in support of your recommendation.
Wonderful. And at this point, I think would be a good time to do a time check to see if we wanted to switch gears and go. I'll let Cynthia head this up on what you'd like to do.
Yeah, so the other items are not as critical for your meeting with council?
Correct.
Okay.
This one's I need to know later on this summer, but right now I don't need to know the answer to it.
Okay, great. I'm going to suggest that we spend 15 to 20 minutes on the equity, but we don't have even 20 minutes, and then we have just 5 minutes worth of announcements. Can you put in the chat if you cannot stay till 8:10? What I don't want to do is have people that have a hard stop have to drop off and then they don't get to participate. But if people don't mind, okay, Micah cannot. So I'm just going to draw a hard line and say it's 7:45. Yeah, so people cannot, and it's not fair when some people have to drop off. So we will stop at 8. Stephen, if you want to introduce it in 10 minutes, which is not very much time. I mean, we spent the last 2 meetings saying how important this topic was for us. So I don't know if we can revisit it again because I do want to give it its due time. I don't want
What
to
I can do is introduce it and pose the question, and we'll forego the discussion, and then everybody just email me your comments, and then I can summarize that at the next meeting.
And then if we need to have a discussion, can we leave time in the next meeting for a discussion? Okay. I don't
Yes.
want to shortchange this. It's one of those things that's incredibly important. It's not always urgent. And those things have a way of getting to the bottom of lists. So I want to be really mindful of that. So why don't you take it away, Stephen? Thanks.
Sure. Sorry, it's giving me a little trouble. I'm trying to share my screen. Oh, I see. Okay, here we go. So, thank you. This is, as Cynthia said, this is a follow-up from the previous discussion from last month. Following our 2 trainings from April and May, I'm briefly just going to go over the questions that the board had posed to us last month to help kind of guide any decision on if we wanted to take on putting together an ad hoc committee to put together an assessment. The purpose of the assessment is that it serves three different purposes. It provides an evaluation framework so that we can consider how different community groups are impacted by a project or decision. It supports our efforts to minimize any adverse impacts that we might find on community groups, but it's also a vital tool in preventing institutional racism in our work and mitigating for that. Typically, there's three different types of solutions that you want to use the assessment, and the first is during a decision-making process, similar to either the TIP or the CIP process, or discussing any type of policy. And then the last is as using it just as a tool to inform leadership decisions. So when we are discussing as a board certain topics, either policy, project, or even design standards, it helps inform city council decisions when we are discussing how the assessment or framework kind of lays out for each of those topics. And it's important to note that these assessments, they're not linear. It's more of a constant cycle that you are always going through and improving. More often than not, we'll make improvements through each cycle because we're likely not going to be perfect the first time around or the second time around, and conditions are constantly changing in our environment. So to be effective, we need to make sure that it stays a cycle and we continue to improve ourselves as well as this process to properly answer the questions and address inequities in the work that we're kind of going through. And I know it was a little last minute because I made the mistake of providing the wrong attachments, but I did fill out each of the examples, the Seattle DOT example and the Renton example for the tool or framework for the Newport project that John has discussed tonight. And so, and with each of the projects, I answered the questions how best I could. And you know, a couple questions I wanted to ask the board were, did you notice any observations reading through the questions and the responses, or what might you do a little bit differently in terms of the type of questions you might ask? And one observation I can make is that not all the questions are really relevant towards a specific topic, and it's not exactly adaptable. And so what we might be doing in our process or in the process working with the larger city framework is establishing questions and kind of a series of questions specific to either a project or a discussion on a policy, because not all of it applies all the way around. And so, you know, for the Seattle and the Renton example, I want to make sure we're not being repetitive in our questions. One of the observations I can make with the Renton example is that there were a few questions that were kind of repetitive because they didn't necessarily apply to projects. They better applied to policies or decision-making processes. And so maybe in our process, we need to have specific questions or certain evaluations just for projects, something that we need to discuss as a board. And so there's a lot of work to kind of undertake to develop an assessment for our purposes, and it's something that staff can't do alone. It's something that we need the board's support on, and so that's part of the reason why we wanted to propose having an ad hoc committee. The scope that the board might take on, or at least the ad hoc committee would take on, would initially be meeting once a week to kind of go through the initial examples and questions to kind of go through. And we have a lot of examples to work through, as well as support from our consultant to help us through this process. And my guess, we'll need to do that for about 3 or 4 weeks until we get to a point where staff will need a little bit more time to process everything and get back to the ad hoc committee with a better assessment or a better formation of questions. And then following the discussion from the ad hoc committee, which may take 4 to 6 weeks, bring it back to the full board to formalize and start using for whenever we get requesting feedback. So every item we eventually bring back to the board, this will be one of the attachments as part of what the board reviews with every project or policy decision that the board's going to be providing comment on. Now, for the city, we don't have a framework to review yet, and the timeline is still in development, but the process is essentially the same in terms of like how the framework or assessment is being developed. We are just a little bit ahead of the full city framework, and the biggest difference is there will be a set of questions that the city will want to ask, but my expectation is that because we have to apply this framework for staff use, board commissions, and city council, it's going to be flexible in that we can reframe some questions to meet our purposes, but still meet the intent of what the city is wanting from the framework itself. And so when the city has a framework, we will eventually incorporate the framework that, or the assessment that this board has with the city's framework. And so that's why it's okay that we are kind of ahead of the city's work on the framework, is because it'll be easy to incorporate the questions. And some of it will likely be simplified a little bit because we're trying to meet certain expectations or intentions from the citywide equity work. So the questions I had for the board tonight was specifically around, should we form an ad hoc committee to kind of take this on now? The alternative route that we could go is we reduce the scope and staff try to take, take a little bit of time to work through some of the questions. We worked through the Seattle and Renton example. We could come up with, using a few more examples to come up with something for an ad hoc committee to take on. Or do we wait for the city assessment or the city framework to get developed before we start discussing the board's own assessment? And that's the extent of tonight's presentation, cutting out the discussion. Cynthia, I don't know where you want to take it from here.
I have a suggestion, just a tactic. Why don't you maybe take this off the screen so that we can see people and have a show of hands? And I think we should take the questions separately. Maybe just a show of hands. Who thinks we should form an ad hoc committee, and separate that from whether you'd be willing to serve on it? So could you just raise your hand if you think that an ad hoc committee is a good idea, not committing to serve on it? I'm seeing only a couple hands. So are there people that you don't think an ad hoc committee is either necessary, or are you just concerned about not wanting to serve, not having time to serve on it? Sujata, I don't see your hand up, and I don't mean to pick on you. Janie, Joseph, Micah, I'm not seeing you guys raise your hand about suggesting we have an ad hoc committee.
Yeah, for me, I think for me, the biggest thing is with the ad hoc committee is timing. I personally think, I mean, working in a large government institution myself, I personally think it would be, it's important for us to continue to get grounded as a board in equity and how our decisions impact that. But I also just feel that if the city is doing this process, I kind of want to see what the product that the city comes up with looks like, and how we can potentially take what the city is doing and adapt it to our work. Because from an institutionalization and when you operationalize something, if it's coming from the city and it's consistent, they're going to want all the directors reporting the same thing. They're going to be looking for some of that consistency. The council's going to want that consistency in reporting. And I'm just concerned that we will have less success in operationalizing the work if we do something separate. So for me, it's just a timing issue. I'd rather sort of see the tool that the city wants and then respond.
Thank you for that. That's interesting. Janie also had mentioned she had a comment when Stephen was done presenting.
I will be short. I know we're short on time, but it's kind of just what Sujata was saying. And knowing about Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, it's not as effective as it was even planned to be. And if the city's going to do it, we might as well wait and see what they have, as Sujata was saying.
I concur. I think it's much more useful to have a whole of government approach first, and then once that is developed, this board can take on like a revisionary stance on that, and approach it with its own perspective.
I would just say that it sounds like those are some really good arguments, and I'm perfectly happy to do it that way. I would just say that I think that I was thinking that we could sort of push a little harder and lead the way by them needing to catch up and so forth. But I see the logic here, and it seems like the majority of there's a slight majority towards people who want to wait for the city to develop theirs. And Stephen, so does anybody else have any huge departure from there? Want to make a hard pitch to form an ad hoc committee now? It seems like Sujata made a good case, and people are seeming to be willing to go with that. Erica has a question about the involvement of the consultant.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, someone else told, like, I heard through the grapevine that she either, like, I don't know if it was her herself created Renton's equity tool, or like, I'm just curious, like, other cities when they've made theirs, like, what is their process, like, what's kind of like, is there a standard? Like, I understand, like, we're Issaquah, like, we're doing our own thing, but is the process of making the equity tool equitable? Like, who are we involving? I know it's like going to be 4 tab, but I just have a couple. Yeah, I like, what's her involvement with this? Because she's a DEI professional, so I want like someone with like those eyes, like scrutinizing it, I guess.
So the presenter that we had in April for the initial training, she did help create the DEI assessment for the city of Renton, but we also have another consultant on board to actually help us with development of the framework and the training of staff. That's going to be helping us further with a lot of this work, and the scope of her involvement is really however we want it. We basically, the contract we have is the city has a certain number of hours that she will work with us each month, which will allow for training, discussions, brainstorming sessions, and work with our boards and commissions when necessary. So one thing I'd like to propose for everybody is, because I know there is a drive to keep kind of momentum going on some of this and not lose several months to wait for the city to put together a framework, we can bring the consultant in to talk about different topics, or other people to talk about different topics, while to give the city time to talk about the framework. That way we don't lose a lot of momentum. We kind of started in April, but at the same time, we're still giving the city time to develop that framework that that would be helpful for some of our work. Is that something, maybe raise a hand of, does everybody like that approach? Seeing just everybody, I think. Okay. So that's what I'll do. I'll talk to the consultant about other topics we can bring. If you, any of you have topics you would like to hear, please email me after the meeting, and we'll look at trying to get those added to our agendas. And then I think John to give a very brief overview of our work plan.
Yeah, I'll go really quickly. We're going to continue the TIP discussion on some of the projects. We're going to talk about the other section in Newport Way, the Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized project. We've got some more equity discussions, and Stephen's going to talk later this year about transit, and one of the topics at the end of the year will be traffic calming. And send it back to you guys.
Oh, I think the next item is the staff report. Are we ready for that? Okay. I'll make this brief. We're still making progress on the streetscape plan, and so we have made some alterations to the roadway so that we can create a direct walkway to the depot park from Front Street, there was a fire hydrant kind of in the way, and a curb ramp that wasn't ADA compliant. So we've upgraded both of those. We moved the fire hydrant and we updated the ADA ramp to be wider so more people can walk to and from Front Street to the park. And next month, we're going to be hopefully getting the equipment and start installation. It'll be about 2 weeks of construction, but really it'll only be about 3 days. Because when we go in, change the utilities or install the utilities, there's a cure time. So really it's only 3 days of construction, but it'll span from 2 weeks basically from when we start to when we end. And by that point, we'll have lighting installed. And then following that in likely early August, late August, we'll install the walkway mural to directly connect Front Street to the Depot Park to kind of add with the environment for the overhead lighting. And then the last thing is the streetery is now going to be hosted by the Downtown Issaquah Association. It's going to be called Al Fresco on Front. And it'll be the last 2 weeks of August and the first 2 weeks of September. That's when it will be this year. That's it for the staff report.
What's it going to be called, Steve?
Al Fresco on Front.
Al Fresco on Front.
The only chair report is I was just going to say that I made a note to ask Stephen and John to put things they need feedback on this session for sure, like this one first. Because I just want you to know that I'm not super comfortable trying to cut people off. It's a really, really good discussion. And so I'll talk with them about how we make sure we order things so that things that can be pushed off get pushed off. And I want to encourage discussion. So if you felt like I was tamping you down, I apologize. I'm just trying to make sure they get what they need. That's it.
Joseph, I don't know if you have a youth report.
Thank you. Sorry.
I don't have a youth report, but I'm hoping to have a youth report next meeting. So yeah.
Any other business announcements?
I guess the last announcements from us is that John and I are going to start trying to involve more staff so that it's just not me and him you see every month. So hopefully you can hear a few more topics.
Well, it sounds like we are ready to adjourn. I forget if we have to decide to adjourn. I think we just adjourn, right? Thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
motion
well,
to
that
adjourn.
will adjourn, and it's 8:05. We're getting close to finishing on time, but that will continue to be a goal. So it's fair and for everybody. So thanks
Motion to
all.
adjourn. Second. Okay.